IVM.
What is it like to be a foreign affairs journalist in India? How do you report on India's relations with other countries like Nepal or Maldives while working out of New Delhi? Devirupa Mitra of The Wire tells us on this episode of the Pragati Podcast. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. We live in an era of fake news, where we don't always trust what we read or hear. But this is also a time where great journalists are doing exceptional journalism, informing the public about what is happening in India and the world. This episode is the third conversation on the Pragati Podcast on journalism. In episode 65, we spoke to Dhanya Rajendran of the News Minute on building an online news portal in India and about doing journalism during the time of natural disasters. In episode 68, we spoke to James Crabtree, formerly with the Financial Times, on being a foreign correspondent in India. Today, I speak to Devirupa Mitra of The Wire on life as a journalist in India on the foreign policy beat. Devirupa has done some stellar reporting on India's complex neighbourhood. And no, I don't mean Pakistan. Her articles have been a source of authoritative information on the Maldives, Nepal, Bangladesh, and more. And she has reported on local developments in neighbouring countries which are of domestic importance and which can have profound implications for India's interests. We'll be back with Devirupa after this short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure that you do. We're IVM Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So we did this last week and we had a pretty good response and we'd like to keep it going. So if you are listening to an IVM podcast, take a screenshot of that, put it on your Instagram story and tag us with it. And what we'll do is we'll repost it on our story so that people get a look at what you're listening to. And people who come onto our stories will get an idea of what kind of things people are listening to. Leave us a comment too, just don't tag us. Last week, we launched two new shows. We launched our first Marathi podcast. It's called Golgappa, hosted by a regular on our network, Trupti Khamkar. Actress Shivani Tangsale is the first guest of the show, and she talks about baking, her Everest climbing experience, and her love for theater. And we also launched the Filter Coffee podcast, hosted by Karthik Nagarajan. On the first episode, Karthik talks to film editor Nishant Radhakrishnan about focus group screenings, OTT platforms, and the future of the Indian film industry. On The Seen and the Unseen, in part one of a two-part conversation, Amit Varma talks to historian and author Ramchandra Guha about Mahatma Gandhi's early years and his life in South Africa. On the Hindi podcast Cinemaya, writer-director Tanuja Chandra joins Swati Bakshi to discuss how she started her career with TV and the joys of making thrillers. On Paisa Vaisa, we have a one-hour exclusive episode with Morgan Housel. He's a partner at the Collaborative Fund and a former columnist on Wall Street. He does a deep dive into the psychology of money. That's a really great episode. And with that, let's continue on with your shows.
Hi Devirupa, welcome to the Pragati Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Pavan.
In the last few months on the Pragati Podcast, I've had the opportunity to talk to many journalists from different fields, even within journalism. So we had Dhanya Rajendran talk about what it was like to build an organization like the News Minute and do journalism in a time of crisis when Chennai was flooding or all of Kerala was flooding, how they went about thinking about journalism, doing journalism while also trying to help relief and rescue. And recently we also had James Crabtree on the show to talk about what it was like to be a foreign correspondent in India. So to me, in the same way, it's an absolute delight to talk to you about what it's like to be a foreign policy journalist here in India and based out of Delhi. So first, could you tell us how you started in this? So you now at The Wire, looking at India's engagement with our neighbours. But where did your personal journey start?
I've been a journalist now for, I think, since I started in 1998 December. So it's been a long journey for me. But I started, like most of my colleagues, I started in the city reporting where you cover urban transport, MCD, that is the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, Delhi government. So you do all the hierarchy of beats there. Then after that, once you do city reporting for several years, then you come to the bureau. So that's how I came to the bureau, which is basically the bureau covers the national bureau, which all the ministries are there. And it was only once I graduated to the bureau that my resident editor at that time, I was in a paper called The Statesman, the Delhi bureau of The Statesman. And just when I joined the bureau, one of their senior correspondents who covered the Ministry of External Affairs had left the paper to go to another paper, basically in the city. So he decided that for some reason I am still not able to fathom that he thought that I was a good fit for the Ministry of External Affairs, even though it's supposed to be one of the very senior beats. And I was expecting to get something like the Ministry of Social Justice or Empowerment or some other beats, which I would have been happy about. But he decided that maybe I should cover Ministry of External Affairs. And that's how my journey started from there.
So why is it considered a senior beat? Is it because it's cooler? Is it because there might be more perks? Why would this be a senior position?
Well, now that I'm covering the beat, I also wonder sometimes that why is it considered to be cooler? Because I don't think it as glamorous as people consider it to be. But I guess because it's something related to foreign affairs, as in foreign Videsh Mantralaya, Videsh mein, that foreign lands. So I guess that association is also linked to it. And it's also that, you deal with the Indian Foreign Service, which supposedly has a certain cachet.
A lot of which has changed over the last 10 to 15 years, right? There was a time when the IFS was the most prized cadre. The top students would go into
Absolutely.
the IFS. Also because that would perhaps be the one way for you to go outside India as
and
well.
Get a taste of, foreign land, which you won't get,
Right.
if you had a normal any job here in that sense.
Which is completely not true anymore.
Not true at
And
all.
today, if you just go by UPSC rankings, which doesn't really mean too much. Most sought after positions are IRS rather than IFS. And there's a whole other dynamic to that, which we don't need to get into today. So there was this attached. Was there also a sense that IFS and the Ministry of External Affairs were all senior people talking about very important issues. So you needed senior journalists just for them to talk to you and explain to you about strategic affairs and all these mysterious things.
There's a certain level of, they expect that the journalist covering MEA would have a certain level of gravitas, and they would need to read a lot of books and to have a certain amount of background, and they would have to have also a certain level of institutional memory also, which the MEA has, but also as a journalist you're supposed to have. Because it's all about precedence. That's what one of the things that I've learned in diplomacy and as a person diplomatic correspondence. You have to read up all the time, and especially when you are new. When I was new in the beat, that was one of the biggest fear that I had, that I was not able to understand the nuance of what they were saying. Because what I was told is basically you should never, what the Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson will tell you is there, but you have to also basically go back and see what that code means exactly, what that phrase is used for.
Because it's all diplomacy, they say something, but the implication of it might
They say something and they mean that, but you have to understand what they are talking about. They won't exactly, for example, even if I may take a contemporary example, they will never use the words South China Sea in any of the statements. It will be about freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight. So you would have to...
the word South China Sea will not be mentioned?
Many of the times.
Wow.
So you have to basically know that when they're talking about freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight, it's basically talking about South China Sea. That when they talk about connectivity and transparency of financing, they're talking about Belt and Road, basically taking a dig at that. So that kind of thing, that you have to go and read, basically you have to go and read the old Indian joint statements and old, basically lots of reading of books. That's why I remember the first year of my beat was basically I had to go and read up all the books of all the foreign secretaries that were saying, and so on and so forth in that sense.
So whereas in that sense, what you're saying is that if someone's talking about the law ministry or women and child empowerment or something, what they're saying can be understood and parsed a little more readily. Even if there is their own, subterfuge and PR and everything that all governments do.
Right.
But here there is another level of all that happening.
Yes, and it's better to basically understand it on your own. And of course, you can go and ask, you can ask clarification from the spokesperson. But it's not as readily available all the time, the answers from the, the ministry. I mean, it's not as immediately available to us. They may take their own sweet time to answer to our questions in that sense. But
So in this, Devirupa, what I and my colleagues have really enjoyed is that you have been now, especially at The Wire, covering India's engagement with its neighborhood, while not focusing extensively on Pakistan. And especially sitting far away in Bangalore, it feels like why are we talking about Pakistan all the time? There's so much other happening. I mean, even in Bangalore, Sri Lanka feels far away, but if you're sitting in Chennai, Sri Lanka doesn't feel far away. I mean, that's the closest connection. So how do you see that playing out in how we talk about our neighbors in the media today, and how does the government sort of talk about our neighbors?
no, one of the reasons, even though it's very kind of you to talk about, that I've been working and you've been enjoying my writings, but I still feel that I'm pretty much at the learning stage right now and have a lot of seniors. There are lots of seniors who are much more experienced than me. And most of them actually have a lot of experience in Pakistan. And that's one of the reasons that I have little hesitated in writing too much or focusing too much on Pakistan, because I think most of my seniors anyway do.
Right.
And they have much more, they have original thinking about it, which at the moment, frankly, I don't have. I'm still looking and observing what is happening and trying to understand the cycles of, boom and bust, which goes all the way. And it's frankly, what I have observed so many years right now is basically makes you quite cynical about India-Pakistan relations and doesn't give you any more insight or it doesn't give you any enthusiasm that there will be anything new happening in the relationship, which I at least don't find it very interesting as such. That's why I find relations with smaller nations much more fascinating to look at, because they have so much other dynamics which goes under, which are not reported per se as such. I started covering Maldives, for example, when the Nasheed was basically resigned. If you remember, the
Right.
former Mohammed Nasheed had resigned, and it was turned in. Basically, then he said the day later, no, I was forced to basically resign under by the police and the military. And the reason I started getting very interested in it, because one of the reasons was basically I couldn't find any experts in Maldives who can explain to me in India why did it happen? Because I wasn't focusing on Maldives before that, but suddenly out of this blue, this happened, and nobody was explaining to me. Apparently, there were lots of others, small symptoms which had led to this event.
Right.
So,
And after that, the entire presidency of Yamin, which has only
after that came basically Wahid, and then after that
Wahid.
came Yamin. And so, but I couldn't find, except for one or two experts, I couldn't find anybody there. So I had to basically then start asking people to get me, I started gathering phone numbers and contacts of people inside Maldives, of the parties, different parties, and to talk to them directly. I think that was basically, got me more, direct insight from what was happening and made me, frankly, interested in that country for on a long-term basis. Because if you're just listening, what happens in many times is basically when you're covering MEA, you are just listening to what the Ministry of External Affairs tells you, or because they do have expertise, they have covered this area, this country. And you always think that they have the best insights. But once you start listening to the voices which are there directly in those countries, it gives you much more confidence that what you're talking about is basically, maybe worth writing about in that sense.
So, I'm very curious about, especially in the case of a country like Maldives, where we have a very important relationship, but India, given its size, can sometimes be either complacent or arrogant, or Indians can be complacent or arrogant in dealing with a smaller island nation, which is still sovereign and considers itself important and is strategically important for India too. So, how many journalists would have even cultivated relationships or contacts across the sea that way with a case like Maldives? Did you see that there were just very few people who were investing in these relationships beyond understanding what, say, the MEA was saying or what the Indian side was saying?
I think there were some journalists who have done that, especially with the opposition, because during Gayoom's time, when Nasheed was in the opposition, they used to come to India for a long time. and whole press conferences here. So they had cultivated journalists. I mean, they had journalist contacts here, and those have carried on so far also. So there were quite a few people actually who do have contacts in Maldives. But I am basically much more interested also in the domestic politics of what domestic dynamics, what happens there.
Right.
Because that's one of the reasons I feel is basically strong that we don't sometimes understand is basically how much agency these countries have and how much the domestic politics plays in their relations with India. We sometimes think that some of the decisions are basically based on external actors, China or whatever, but many of them quite are basically also due to internal egos between different political actors and
We've seen
politicians.
some of this happen in Bangladesh, right?
Yeah.
Where Khaleda Zia, the prime minister, I mean, they
Mm.
come from the same social circles. There was this, I think, phone call between them that was
Yeah,
released where it's two people just fighting in a
yeah,
very,
that was
very,
hilarious.
very silly manner, very
Yeah.
petty manner,
Yeah,
not becoming of people who are leaders of countries, and so it's these dynamics that need to be captured and reflected in good reportage and journalism as well, right? So do you think that one of the challenges here is that India does not have too many foreign correspondents, where there's no Indian journalist who actually sits in Maldives full time,
No.
right? There we
Or
have
any of the I can't remember any of them sitting in any of the neighborhood SAARC countries. I think Hindu has a full-time correspondent in Dhaka maybe.
right.
And maybe they have some Indian Express, but they have local correspondents basically who are writing for Indian Express and Hindu. They're not basically outstation correspondents from the paper.
But the idea of someone, I mean, with foreign correspondence, with say the New York Times or elsewhere, the idea is that you grow in your career also
Right.
by working in various countries, right, and get various contacts. Unfortunately, in our country today, with our income and our, I mean, that's not been always possible.
Exactly.
I think the Hindu's probably been better than most other newspapers.
They have at least somebody in Colombo.
Somebody in Colombo, somebody in China.
Yeah.
I think
Hindustan Times used to have somebody in Colombo, but that stopped because they thought that since the civil wars ended, so it's not any more interesting. So then they obviously sent that person to China,
which is rather sad.
Yeah,
So the
yes.
country had war, so we will have a journalist, and then it's not interesting anymore.
Exactly.
So, so in this, therefore, you have to then do this out of Delhi, right? So I'm curious, how much do you get to travel in order to do your reportage, and how does that work? Are there ever junkets from the Indian government side or foreign government side? Could you share a little about that?
I would love to travel more. For example, I would have loved to go to Bhutan for the elections. Because I really wanted to understand what was happening there, and we had a very interesting results there. But obviously, it depends on the budget of the organization where they want to spend the money. So I didn't actually go to. I wanted to go to again Maldives. I had been planning to, but I didn't get the visa this time. They didn't give the visa for the elections.
Okay.
So even though I was planning to go for that, so that I missed it out again. But usually it depends on the what kind of event is happening. I mean, for example, the Wire had last year that I found very interesting was basically they had allowed me to go to Iran to cover the elections, which no other Indian news media was even interested in. But that kind of for me was a very interesting and very insightful visit because it showed me how the kind of their first of all the media how they operated and how much exactly when they talk about democracy in Iran, what do they exactly mean by democracy, and how much role does the people have, and how much do the people feel empowered exactly with the kind of democracy that they have. So it was very interesting to talk to the people who were standing in line and who actually stood in line till 10 o'clock in the night sometimes, that they were actually felt a certain stake in the democracy there, even though it's a very guided democracy.
And it's important to, I mean, sort of filter these through Indian eyes as well,
Exactly,
right?
because otherwise, for example, I wasn't able to understand. I mean, how do you define the democracy that they have? I mean, they have a certain theocratic setup there, and they even filter what kind of candidates are going to be standing for elections? Do you really call it democracy? So you have to basically, I wanted to get my own understanding of what actually the people, do they think about it in that sense? Do they really think that they're in a democracy in the first place? And actually, most of them do in that sense, because they did stand in the election and they stand in the voting booths, and they were.
And it's, I mean, while it is very different in India, then thankfully we do not have theocratic control. Even here, internal party democracy is completely missing in most places.
Most places, yeah.
It's not like candidates are chosen through popular means, and then we have to select a few. But we still have a very strong faith in our own democracy.
Absolutely.
Right. So to me, it's really great, because when sometimes we read this only through the eyes of an American or a British journalist, there's a lot we can learn, and it's not a slur against them. But
coming back to your question about basically if we travel more, I think we should be traveling more and more, actually, not less. And the only thing is that most of the journalists, that MEA journalists, we usually travel out when the Prime Minister is going somewhere, you know. So then we'll follow his movement wherever he's going. But I mean,
so tell me about that. Is that something you've had the opportunity to do in the past?
I had done that. I had basically done it in my earlier, especially in my early organization in the New Indian Express. So I remember going, especially for the first visit by the Prime Minister to New York and Madison Square Garden, to US, basically.
Okay.
You know, the first diaspora event that he had. That was quite interesting, actually, in that sense. I've done that part also. But I don't know how inside, I mean, it's much more, frankly, the way it's conducted, I'm not sure how much access I would get anyway. So I don't think it's for a reporter per se. I don't know how much time I should waste on that.
Right.
Because
that's like a guided tour.
That's like a guided tour. You will have a certain time that the foreign secretary or joint secretary or somebody else will come and give you the briefings. Then you will anyway get out the readouts on what the PM is saying. That will be posted on the website. So it's quite well, the release of all the information and whatever the PM is saying is done quite well by the MEAs, managed quite well. So I'm not sure how useful it is to actually go there.
Fair enough.
Following him on his
So it
meetings.
might be better to do something independently if given the opportunity.
Yes, I would rather do something independently. Go, for example, I was telling you about the Bhutan elections. I would have loved to go there. Or maybe go to Sri Lanka right now is frankly very interesting.
And we still don't have a very good handle on what's happening there. We don't understand necessarily all the local dynamics, right?
It depends on who you're talking to in that sense. I don't unnecessarily, I think the MEA has a pretty good idea what's happening there, because they have some good people there and they know who are the, players, and all the players are talking to India actually.
Okay.
All the time. So they know what is happening there, but India has been very deliberately keeping a very, very low profile in the current situation. And I think that's a good idea, to keep a low profile in any, in the neighborhood.
Especially during elections and local politics, because India has always had this image of being a big brother bully.
Exactly.
Big brother is again a very kind word sometimes, right?
And already Sirisena had talked about this raw REW plot in his famous cabinet meeting. So it's best to not to, even show that the Indian ambassador, Indian High Commissioner was going and meeting Rajapaksa or, Ranil Wickremesinghe. But they have a pretty good idea about what's happening there. And because all of the players are actually talking to the Indian side.
We'll be back with Devirupa after this short break.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune into Know Your Qanoon with me, Amit Varma. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.
Welcome back. So is that something that you see a lot? I've heard this offhand from people about how sometimes when it comes to the domestic politics of India's neighbours, the Indian representative there, be it the ambassador or some other contact that the local political leaders are comfortable with, often feel like the outside party whom they can all talk to if there are differences. So sometimes do Indian representatives become sort of
Agony aunt,
mediators?
almost like an agony aunt sometimes, I feel.
Agony aunt? So that's one. So what all do you see the Indian side sort of doing? One is agony aunt, the others they can be meddling. Or what else? Like, do we become sort of conduits for conflict, like settlement?
It depends on what they're talking about, right? I mean, also the nature of the High Commissioner, how far they want to take up things, and also the nature of the government at that time in the headquarters. What is the policy that they want to pursue? So, I mean, for example, in Nepal, I mean, every player, every political party will come and talk to the Indian embassy and Indian ambassador there. But at the same time, I mean, it's a very strange relationship that people have there with the Indian embassy there, that it is seen as a way, almost as a viceroy. Out of all the SAARC countries, perhaps Nepal, the Indian ambassador in Nepal has a much more difficult task, because he's not only talking to the various political leaders there, but there's so many political leaders in India who are talking to the political leaders there. Okay, so there are various like strands, which are different strands who have various interests, who he has to manage somehow in that sense. And because, for example, the Nepali Congress guy there would be talking to somebody here, the Indian Congress guy or somebody else they have close relations, and they're constantly talking to each other.
And this is different from, say, even in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka?
Yes, I think so.
So the politician to politician contact is stronger?
Yeah, I think so.
How do you see the relations?
Except Bangladesh, can I just intervene? Bangladesh, there's a stronger connection, say, between, say, Pranab Mukherjee, for example, has a very strong role in Bangladesh. Okay. But he has his own, he knows what he's talking about. I mean, in that sense, the Indian High Commission doesn't have to worry that he will rock the boat kind of thing in the...
Right. But especially, so Nepal is still, I guess, a little different. I'm still not able to get a full sense of it. But with Bangladesh, the border states Indian border states have their own politics around it, right? So how do you see that playing out from Delhi?
This is very interesting. I mean, I had gone with recently, this year itself, to Bangladesh for a media conclave where they had a lot of media from the West Bengal. Okay. And the way they talk to the Bangladeshis, or the Bangladeshis talk to them, I mean, it's basically like they're one big family. And they have actually minute interest in what is happening inside Bangladesh. And I mean, they have much more looking minutely at the, who are the different players that I don't frankly look into it that closely in that sense. But so it's they are much more, I mean, they know what the river situation is, the water flows, they know what they're talking about when they're talking about Tista and the various other rivers. That I can't, sitting from Delhi, frankly, I don't have that much I would love to do that kind of reporting, but they have been there to those rivers. They can talk to when the, Bangladeshis talk about the Tista, they can say that, Tista, it's not really going to happen. I mean, anyway, the water is flowing, so it doesn't make a difference. So it's very fascinating to go and listen to them. And we had an interaction with the Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, and they had so many questions, and she was very happy to answer to them in that sense. So it's much more easier if you actually send the media from the bordering state, those countries, because they have immediacy with those countries, which I think even they appreciate, that they're not talking to somebody from Delhi who has a much more distant, with whom they don't have to compete. For example, that's one of the things, they don't have to compete for attention from Delhi. These people are just focused or are interested in, these states.
So it's not about grabbing one column space in a Delhi national newspaper.
Yeah.
But an entirely different dynamic.
Exactly.
I mean, this might be hubris or not, I don't know, but sitting in Bangalore, it feels like sometimes the Bangalore connection with, say, the United States, which is not a geographical neighbor, is sometimes more intense and more immediate than perhaps what's happening between New Delhi and United States.
Really?
Like the Bangalore obsession. And
with Silicon Valley, and you mean that?
One is Silicon Valley, the other is the movement of people.
Okay.
Because visas are a matter
H-1B
of
visas and all.
are a matter of careers for a lot of people in
Mhm.
Bangalore and Hyderabad and
Mhm.
a couple of other
Right.
places. Similarly, I'll tell you that when the United States there is a national holiday,
Mhm.
the traffic goes down in Bangalore
Okay.
because the number of people who are working at tech companies which are doing services for US companies, they don't get work on that day.
Okay.
And Thanksgiving dinners become a thing in Bangalore because you have a lot of people who have now come back.
Right.
So in that sense, to me, sitting in Bangalore, to me, visa movement of people is far more important than, say, talking about defense deals and other things, just because the interests feel a little different.
Right.
Right. So like, I think trade and FDI and all that matter way more than government to government sale of F-16 or not of F-16. Even, for example, IPR issues. A lot of them sometimes matter for people back in Bangalore, be it Biocon talking about biosimilars, be it other small Indian companies talking about their own IP regime. So to me, that's very interesting because even those companies, they know that they have to invest in public policy people in Delhi,
Right.
because a lot of things happen here. So I'm just fascinated by that dynamic between various regional centers, power and influence, and Delhi and foreign centers.
Yes, and I think most of the think tanks right now they are trying to diversify from outside to places outside Delhi, right? I think you have Gateway in
Yeah.
Bombay, which does mostly geoeconomics.
Yes, and we sit happily in Bangalore, far away
Yes.
from Delhi.
But
And
Chennai had a very good, I think, think tank on Chinese studies,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken, in that sense. I think Calcutta has some good think tanks which
look
do a
at
lot of things
Bangladesh.
on BIMSTEC and on connectivity and Act East, basically. In fact, the ME, when they interact with the think tanks, I think many of their Act East issues that they want to get papers, they do it with Calcutta think tanks.
And we probably need more think tanks in Guwahati and
And
other
Guwahati, yeah.
centers
Yes.
as well.
Yeah.
So coming back to New Delhi,
Mm-hmm.
what's it like being on the foreign policy beat? Does the MEA do a lot of press briefings? Who gets to go there as a journalist in the wire? Can you talk a little bit about credentials and things like that?
So since I've been covering MEA beat for a long time. So we usually have now a weekly briefing, which happens on Thursdays in the afternoon, but it can happen any other day also. Which is set basically. Usually that happens every time unless a spokesperson is traveling, say with the external affairs minister, the PM, or whoever else. Besides that, there would be press conferences, briefings done prior to visits by the prime minister and the president and the vice president. So it is done at the level of the secretary or the foreign secretary, usually at that level. But besides that, if the other briefings which would happen is basically there's something very, very important which happens. The surgical strikes, I remember, was the last time there was a big briefing. And I can't remember other specific briefing that we were called for, public briefings. But besides that, we also do, we sometimes have background briefings for, journalists.
So that's off the record,
That's off the record
material for you to use however you wish to.
Exactly.
Okay.
But that's, again, it's not a frequent occurrence which happens. So it's, I will say at the most once a month.
Okay.
But even less than that.
So what would have happened, say, with something like the Doklam crisis unfolding, right? So this was something that was burning for a while. Lots of things were happening. What was it to be a foreign policy reporter when that thing was in motion?
Oh, it was very frustrating actually at that time because ME was not reacting, if you remember, the first few days when it happened. They reacted only after the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Chinese Defense Ministry issued the statements together on the same day. Then after that, ME reacted, I think, and the Bhutan Foreign Ministry also reacted. And after that, there was more or less silence. There was public silence. They were repeating, if there was questions asked, the answers were the same.
Okay.
So there was nothing more that they were going to say publicly over it. And we were told, but we were explained at the same time why it was happening. That they were not going to talk about it, that their policy is basically not to get provoked by the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the statements that were coming out, which were, if you remember, very aggressive.
Right.
You know,
From the foreign ministry down to that idiotic video
yeah,
from
exactly,
the Chinese news media, right?
exactly. And it was also very, at the same time, they also needed to, even though they were not talking publicly, but they also needed to speak to the media and explain to them the technicalities
Right.
of, because it was a very technical issue about all the agreements, so, 19th century agreements that were signed and so
And
on.
the terrain being something so remote beyond the imagination of most
And
of us.
we also wanted to understand exactly, where exactly that happened. Because I think in the beginning also we have a little confused about where Doklam was in the first place and where the whole, standoff was happening. So that became clearer after that were few days in that sense.
So how would, say, the Indian government go about educating people in the media or elsewhere about at least how they viewed these situations and provide
So
this
there were
context?
background briefings at that time,
Hmm.
and collectively and specifically, depending on the questions that you were asking, and obviously the spokesperson had to be very well versed in exactly all the technicalities of the case, and at the same time all the think tanks were also briefed about it.
Okay.
So they had a lot of people, former ambassadors, who knew about the subject, who also were briefed also what's happening, and they also went and talked to the think tanks. In fact, sometimes we used to get more information. Sometimes if you went to a closed door, session in a think tank, in one of the major think tanks, and they were much more sometimes forthcoming on what is exactly happening there.
Right, and maybe someone. So that's also the utility, perhaps, of someone who's retired and no longer part of the formal establishment, because they can
Exactly.
be more candid about things that an official spokesperson
Exactly.
cannot speak about.
And
right?
these are people who have been posted there in various capacities.
So they have context and history.
Exactly. And they're not just former diplomats, former military personals who were posted in those areas. So they utilized all these people at that time to explain to the media that, explain to the various people who were writing on it, what are the nuances exactly of the various agreements.
That's fascinating. In this time, what was the Chinese embassy here in Delhi doing?
Well, the Chinese embassy was very active at that time. Their YouTube had suddenly become active. They had, I think it was the first video that they posted was from a political counselor, basically explaining that they are the ones who are completely right on this, that Doklam is theirs. And then the deputy chief of mission there, he called some of the reporters and he gave a very detailed, I think it was they issued a very detailed statement, I would say a booklet kind of thing on their position, and explain and giving all the things about Nehru said this and Nehru said that, and that basically the trilateral, the tri-junction is not there exactly, it's somewhere else, and so on and so forth.
So sort of their version of everything.
Exactly. So we had some questions, we talked to him, but it was interesting to hear what they were saying directly in that sense, rather than not just reading the transcript of the foreign ministry in Beijing.
So in that sense, is there utility in even speaking to someone, say, from the Chinese embassy in Delhi about, say, what's happening in the South China Sea, or do they also follow like a party or a government line about things? And
Obviously they follow a very much a government line.
So the usefulness of that extra conversation may not necessarily be very high.
It depends exactly on the kind of diplomat that you are speaking to. Because nowadays also Chinese diplomats have changed a lot. Earlier they were very they felt like party chicks. But now they are quite actually smooth and slick.
And there's this one Chinese diplomat in Pakistan who is a Twitter sensation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And often saying outrageous things on Twitter.
Yeah. And the Chinese ambassador in India now has a Twitter account. So, and they have a YouTube account, of course, in that sense. So they have been pretty active, and they have actually revamped their press department quite well right now. So much more active in that sense, and much more willing to talk to you.
Okay.
But depends on what they want to talk to. You can ask them a lot of questions, but it depends on them if they want to be interested in talking back to you.
Right. especially about things that they don't want to talk
Exactly.
about. I'm guessing they won't be too forthcoming on Xinjiang or Tibet or other
Yes.
things.
But I'm not sure if any Indian journalists actually have asked them about it.
Fair enough.
So
there is opportunity. Devirupa, could you tell us a little about how investigative journalism might work within this space in India? We understand how that works with, say, the CBI or elsewhere, but what would that mean in the foreign policy case?
Well, in an investigative journalism in MEA would perhaps mean, for example, I can give you an example of what had happened when the 39 Indians that had been killed in Iraq. So when the first announcement was made, I can give a personal example. When the announcement was made in, first that MEA said, we think that these people have been kidnapped. And they gave us the name of the place of the employment agency that they were working for. So I was basically Googling and checking if there's any contact number for this agency. Does it really exist? So there was a number. So I decided to call up. So the first answer that they gave was basically, that was very strange. I thought I told them that this is what we have heard from the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, that all these people have been kidnapped. That person said that no, they were just going to come back. And I said, quick, fine. I mean, that's also makes a story in that sense. These people are saying that,
So this is somebody in Iraq.
Somebody in Iraq. But then we decided this doesn't make sense. Like, we decided to call up that person again. So then he gave the number of another person. Basically, this guy was obviously, his English was not very good. So I decided to basically try to get the help of somebody who understands Arabic. So that person then called up this guy and he gave a number. And that guy basically gave the number of one of his Bangladeshi employees, who they said were working with Indians. So that Bangladeshi then employee, then we managed to get that speak to the Bangladeshi employee, which is very surprising because he had already crossed over into Erbil. And he said, I'm in Erbil right now. But he had a very difficult Bangladeshi accent and he was speaking only in Bengali, and which I don't understand very well. I mean, in that sense, he was speaking very Bengal accent, so I had to ask by help of my boss who understands that. But then he said that, which we were very apprehensive on hearing it. Basically, he said all of them have died. I met only one of the Indians who has managed to escape, and he said all of them have died.
Wow.
So that was kind of very, that was the same day as that the announcement had been made that they had been kidnapped.
And the Indian side was in denial for a while, right?
So we only announced it this year, right? That they have all been killed. So it was very, even for us, to write it, basically, how do we write that? It was very difficult for us to we had a lot of discussions. How do we say that basically these 39 Indians could be killed?
You don't have like a second source who can verify independently.
Exactly.
None of those usual standards.
And we don't know the person we have not spoken to the Indian who supposedly had escaped, who said that basically all of them have been killed. So, but we did confirm it from the ministry, basically, that there was one Indian who had managed to escape. And this was a story that he was telling. So we knew that part, that he was telling the story to the authorities, and they had managed to be in contact with him. So that part was there. So we had to write it in. So that was the investigative that we had to. I think that was one example of investigation that you can do.
But otherwise, is it easy to get documents out of MEA?
Not at all. Okay. It's not as leaky as, say, Defense Ministry or any other ministries in the government of India right now.
So there's a far tighter control over information.
Yes. And because it's a very small ministry, ultimately, everybody it's a very small, it's almost like a family, frankly. Mm-hmm. Because if you see in other ministries, it's full of IAS who will go from one place to another, and they can go flit from one ministry to another ministry. But this is basically just IFS people. They'll either be in headquarters or they'll go abroad.
Right.
And they are the most 3 or 4 people in different departments. So it's very difficult to leak anything
without it being traced back
exactly.
to you. Oh yeah, that makes so much sense, because the IAS officers, there can be many people who would have served here and then be somewhere far away, but would have access to some document.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes it.
And Defense Ministry is much more bigger, place. I mean, much more. You have the army, you have so many services together.
And you have the more complex politics behind
Yes.
leaking documents and
Exactly.
making it public.
And much more other vested interests. There are other middlemen, so many other agencies working. Basically, I meant is it's not just the defense ministry. You have also other, for example, companies who are interested in weapons procurement. They would also be leaking documents. They would have their own contacts there.
So in something like the Rafale discussion, there are lots of players
exactly
who have interests in sharing different pieces of information.
That kind of dynamic is not there in MEA.
So maybe this would be one of the final things that I want to ask you. So when something like the Rafale deal is in the news, how is the MEA looking at this, or how would you be looking at it on the MEA beat? Because yes, it's a Ministry of Defense and acquisition issue, but it's also a France-India relation issue. So I'm very curious how the ministry looks at it and how, as a foreign policy journalist, you would be looking at it.
The point is that Rafale have not really touched on it, frankly.
Okay.
The Rafale issue has not yet, like we were talking about, is basically not yet escalated to the Ministry of External Affairs per se. It's not an issue that is on our radar as a MEA journalist. Maybe it will be in the future.
And it's not entered the transactional nature of the bilateral relationship yet.
Not yet.
So in that sense, even the MEA has not felt a need to comment or anything. It's purely a Ministry of Defense affair.
And that's the best kind of thing that the MEA spokesperson also loves, that they can basically, if it's entirely related to Defense Ministry and another ministry, they would please speak to those ministries, that they will not answer anything related to that at all.
Devirupa, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
And I'm glad we are recording this in the Wire studios, and you've been gracious enough to give me the space to do this recording.
Not at all. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. Please share this episode with others, and please help spread the word about podcasts in India. If you listen to the Pragati Podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, please leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. Visit thinkpragati.com for your daily dose of brain fodder. Subscribe to the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcasts app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We are there everywhere.
Hello, everybody. We have a brand new daily podcast we're working on with Bloomberg Quint. All you need to know provides the top news on business, markets, and the economy so that you can stay ahead of the curve. Tune in every morning on BloombergQuint.com, the IVM Podcast app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
You say jogging, and I'm telling you a story about a man who dated 3 sisters. You say boss, Kurla, and it's about a guy who went out to a party where they were selling beef. This is Anand Sivkumaran, aka The Croc. My show, The Croc's Tales. You give me a word, I'll tell you a story. Words aapke, kahani aapke liye. Do tune in on Monday and Thursday on the IVM website, app, and anywhere you get your podcast from.